Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm doing another 8th of the Great, and this time I'm going to be focused on British history. So I'm doing a new non-fiction challenge which is around the world in 12 non-fiction, and that is where I'm attempting to read history books from other countries. And in that video I talked about the fact that I've read fairly extensively in British history, so I thought it'd be nice to put together a little recommendations video. I'm also going to have a separate one for Victorian/Georgian history, which is definitely a subsection that I've read even more about, but this one has got a nice spread of different time periods for you. So the first book I'm going to talk about is She-Wolves by Helen Castor. This is about 3 women who ruled England before Elizabeth I. Because Elizabeth I very much has this urban legend around her of the idea of like the first true Queen of England. And actually there have been many people in the past who have been really major players in sort of the geopolitics of British history. So this is focused on 3 different women. It's Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France and Margaret of Anjou. All 3 of those actually come from France, or areas that now would be considered France originally, but ruled England as well, because it's in that period of time where British rule is very much flicking backwards and forwards, and there's a lot of French occupation, and we're really just bickering with France constantly. My personal favourite, this is Eleanor of Aquitaine. She's one of my absolute favourite queens of history. She's a complete, just like absolute OG baller. She's the mother of Richard the Lionheart, and it's really, really interesting. And it's just a lovely look at history pre the Tudors and pre kind of time period that a lot of people are very familiar with. Great detail. As with any of these books, with the history, some of the names get a little bit confused because I really love calling everybody Henry and Richard. Exhausting. But yeah, really, really interesting, lovely, sweeping look at a very different time period than a lot of people have read. The next book I'm going to talk about is Witches, James I and the English Witch Hunts by Tracey Borman. This is a much shorter book compared to a lot of the others, which makes it a lot more accessible, I think. And James I is Elizabeth I's son, who got incredibly obsessed with witches and trying to stamp out witchcraft in the UK. And this is especially looking at the Pendle witch trials, which were a particularly big area within kind of Jacobean history. So yeah, really, really interesting. A lot of the like human elements to this. We follow a particular group of women as they're accused, and we really get to see a lot about what their lives were like. And it's a really interesting look at sort of religion and the way that Catholicism and Protestants were sort of arguing and having a lot of there was a lot of uproar within sort of the religious template of the British country, and sort of dependent on who was on the throne and what did and didn't become acceptable, and then where you can draw the lines of witchcraft, and how witchcraft as an accusation could be used not just against women but kind of against people in general as a way of like targeting your neighbour who you didn't like. Very, very interesting. And if you enjoy this one as well, there's a really lovely fiction book called The Familiars, which is along a very similar line. So fantastic read. Bringing it a lot more modern, we have Bluestockings, the remarkable story of the first women to fight for an education by Jane Robinson. This is looking at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, when women were still very much considered inferior to men and were really limited in what education they could pursue. It's about the first 5 women who were allowed into British universities. Now these universities are indeed Cambridge and Oxford, of course they are, and I think a couple of the London ones join suit as well. So there is an element of privilege to this background, but it's a really interesting look at what was happening around then and how women were viewed societally, and just the amount of sort of aggression that they had to deal with, the amount of resistance to their place within education, and how these women really put up with so much to fight for their right to be able to experience an education, which now means that we can do that today. So really lovely. Again, a bit of a shorter read, a nice one to sort of breeze through, and a real like social human history. We get to learn a lot about the day-to-day lives of the women and their studies and what it would have been like for them compared to big macro events. So very enjoyable read. From micro to macro and from modern to ancient, we're now going to be talking about Viking Britain by Thomas Williams. This is a look at Viking Britain. As you can imagine, the Vikings are a huge part of British history, especially up in York and sort of the northern areas. And this is a look at some of the misunderstandings of the Vikings as being these sort of dirty, very aggressive individuals with the horned helmets. And this is trying to kind of get rid of a lot of those myths. It looks at things like all sorts of various wars and battles, a lot of which did start to go over my head. I really struggle with the names of like generals and things. It all starts to kind of wash over me. And then more of the day-to-day kind of social side of things, and a big chunk about religion, of which the Viking religion and all the kind of Norse gods are absolutely fascinating. So that was a section that I particularly enjoyed. I think as a starting place for Viking history and ancient British history in general, this is absolutely fantastic. It's incredibly comprehensive. Like I say, it did lose me at certain points, so it really depends on what you're interested in, because it covers everything from military to more mundane. And for me, I'm really here for the day-to-day life rather than the military side, but it is a nice broad range and you can always skim the bits that you're not that bothered by. The next book I'm going to talk about is Black and British by David Olusoga. This is an incredible, very chunky, comprehensive look at Black people and British history. So it's very much this idea that Black people were sort of connected only to colonialism and the slave trade, and that's sort of very much an American thing, whereas Britain actually had a big hand in that, in the various kind of colonies that we definitely took over. And then also the idea in British history that Black people came over with Windrush, and that there was no Black people in America before this point. And this book is basically just refuting that idea completely, looking all the way back at very ancient history, including like Roman times, where there are definitely examples of Black people in Britain, and then going all the way forward to modern day and looking really in depth at things like Windrush, colonialism and slavery, and Britain's role within that. It's a very intense read, as I'm sure you can imagine, but it's incredibly rich in detail, just absolutely fascinating, and the control and craft over handling such a wide range of information is just phenomenal. I listened to this on audiobook and would totally recommend that, but yeah, it's just the kind of thing that it is almost overwhelming in its information. It was just absolutely fantastic, and I do think again it's one of these books that had something for everybody, because you are sweeping through so many different time periods that if there is a section that you're really not bothered by, you could always skip forward to one that is a little bit more interesting to you, just based on what your preferences for different time periods and sort of where your interests lie. Or if you're like me and you just love history in general, it is this incredibly comprehensive sweeping look, and David manages to maneuver through them with a real elegance and grace that keeps the pace going. One of the chapters in that book is about Black Tudors, and David references a book quite a lot, which I then was so interested in I actually went out and bought myself, and that is Black Tudors, The Untold Story by Miranda Kaufman. This, as the title suggests, is a look at Black people in Britain within the Tudor time, which again, like I say, is something that we don't often think about, because this would like predate the major slave trade and sort of time period that we think of individuals being forced over from other countries. So Black Tudors is a look at 10 different individuals who are referenced in various different materials and source materials from the Tudor times and what their lives are like. Really, really interesting. You get a lovely wide range from servants to people who own their own property, musicians. There's a lovely one about a diver. There were salvage divers. That particular chapter was just really cool. Talks about a whole profession that I didn't even know existed. Like shipwrecks were a really big deal in Tudor time, and there was like a whole profession of people going diving to try and recover things from the ships, because they were quite often sink like in or around port. Just incredibly cool and interesting. So if you enjoy Black and British, or if you're looking for a more specific niche area, this one's really cool, and it's definitely a very different look at Tudors, where we quite often just get a lot about Henry VIII and his wives, or the various sort of fights that were going on around then. This is a lot more of a like slice of life look at Tudor history. The next book I want to talk about is Roaring Girls by Kyte. This is the forgotten feminist of British history, and again it's looking at a bunch of different individuals spread across quite a wide time period, all who would be classed as kind of feminist in some way. The book has a really interesting conversation about how anachronistic it can be to try and apply modern terms like feminist to people in history, when those kind of like frames and terminology isn't really around in that time or useful as a way of communicating with them. But all of these women did something to sort of fly in the face of traditional gender roles of their time period, whether it be how they presented themselves and their gender, or the work that they sought out. And it's just a really interesting look at women who probably have been forgotten and left by the wayside. So because it bounces through a load of different time periods as well, really interesting, very comprehensive look. And again, with a lot of these, we're really zooming into their micro, what their lives were like and what the lives of the individual people were like in that time period, because I find a lot of history can get very macro and really look at like military and sort of royalty rather than the day-to-day. So very interesting look, and an interesting look at how we interact with history as modern people, which again I think is just like a separate sub-question that is incredibly interesting when you are interested in history in general. The next book is Mudlark by Lara. This is a book about the act of mudlarking, which is basically when the tide goes out on the Thames, you walk along and you find bits of sort of history, artifacts, all sorts of like pottery, coins, various things that have been kind of left on the wayside or thrown into the Thames over history. It is a look at that hobby and then the various bits that Laura has found on her travels. So because of that, we do get a lovely sweeping look at the history of London in particular. Now, I gave this 3 stars because I wasn't actually that bothered by it. I listened to it on audiobook and there was just something about the narration style or Laura's writing that didn't really gel for me, but it should have, because this definitely should have been right on my street. So I think if you're a big fan of history, you should still totally give this book a go, even though I didn't overly enjoy it, because it has all of the ingredients that should have worked for me, but sometimes these books just like don't hit the right, sort of strike the right chord with you as such. But yeah, very, very interesting, looking also around like the legislation of mudlarking and again how we interact with history, whether it be like casual hobby collectors or people from museums and sort of very legitimized sort of search parties who are collecting this information for the general public, and how those two can interact and how history should be for everybody, but in such a way that we then aren't having it taken only by the very few who have got their own private collections, if that made sense. So very cool, very interesting, lovely little snapshot of London. And the final book I want to talk about is Fabulosa by Paul Baker. This is a look at Britain's secret gay language of Polari. So this is again a lot more of a modern history. It's probably kind of 19th to 20th century, and this is a look at the secret language that developed over time, the gay community used to be able to talk about various things openly around people without them being found out, during the period of time where being gay was very, very heavily discriminated, as opposed to just the casual discrimination that happens now. So Polari has influences in sailors and sort of the language from there. There's Romany influences. It has a whole bunch of different things that feed into it, and it's a really interesting conversation about the communities that can form when you cannot be seen out in the open, gay rights and how they have been throughout history, and then also a look at Polari and sort of how Polari is still used today, where it kind of has crept into modern vernacular, and how things like the appropriation of hidden terminology and sort of underground communities can happen when they start to come into light, and you start to look at things like sort of, you know, drag queens and yes slay and like all the various wording that has definitely been appropriated but means something very different within the internal community. Again, super, super interesting, and Paul Baker has done loads of individual podcasts on a variety of different shows about Polari and his work with Polari. So if a whole book is looking a little overwhelming for you, please do Google his name and have a little listen before committing to 300 odd pages. But yeah, fantastic, interesting read. So there you have it. There are, I think, 8, maybe 9, I've started to lose track, books about British history. Do let me know if you've read any of these down below, and like I said, I'm going to hopefully be having a Georgian/Victorian one coming out soon, and I do have some videos planned on like European and general world history, so I'm going to be covering a whole bunch of stuff, definitely, as well as we get up to the run-up to non-fiction November. So have a wonderful reading week, and I will chat to you soon. Bye!